The morning arrived, cold and gray, over Callaway County, the kind of morning that settles into old wood and rusted hinges and stays there. The First Meridian Bank occupied the corner of the main square, its columns scrubbed white against a sky the color of ash. Inside, the lobby carried the particular silence of a room where people had learned not to raise their voices. The carpet was the shade of dried mud. The ceiling lights hummed without warmth at the far end of the room. Behind a long mahogany counter that had never known a single scratch sat Gerald Foss. He was a man who wore his suits the way other men wore armor. Pressed, immovable, certain. He sat with his hands folded over a thick manila folder, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had already decided how this morning would end. The lobby held maybe a dozen people, a young couple near the door with a stroller, two older men in work coats waiting their turn on wooden chairs along the wall, a teller with a practiced smile behind her cage. None of them looked at the door when it opened. But the door did open, and in walked Della Marsh. She was 63 years old, though that morning she could have passed for older. She wore a coat the color of dried tobacco, its collar turned up against the cold. Her boots were clean but deeply worn, the leather creased around the toes from years of ground that did not give easily. She carried a cloth sack in her right hand, the kind used for storing seed or feed grain, its neck drawn closed with a length of twine. She carried a second thing, too, tucked under her left arm. A folder, brown, soft at the corners, held shut with a rubber band that had started to crack. She did not hurry. She crossed the lobby with the kind of walk that belongs to people who have crossed cold ground all their lives and know there is no point in rushing it. She stopped at the end of Gerald Foss's counter and placed the sack on the surface in front of her. She did not speak first. She waited. Gerald Foss looked at the sack, then at her hands, then at her face. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes adjusted. The way a man adjusts when something unexpected appears on a landscape he thought he had already read completely. He said, "Mrs. Marsh, I have to say, I'm surprised you came back." His voice was smooth, unhurried, professionally kind, in the way of a man who has mastered the appearance of patience without ever actually feeling it. She said nothing for a moment. She set the folder on the counter beside the sack, carefully flat, as though placing something fragile on hard ground. "I told you I'd be back," she said. "A year ago. I told you I'd be back." He smiled, the thin, bureaucratic smile of a man managing an inconvenience. "Mrs. Marsh, the situation hasn't changed." The property in question, the 60 acres on the eastern edge of the county, was assessed at a valuation that simply does not support the kind of loan you were asking for. The bank's position was and remains the same. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't come for a loan," she said. She rested one hand on the sack. The room did not react, but it was listening now. To understand what was inside that sack, you would need to go back, not 1 year further. You would need to go back 31 years to a piece of land that had been in the Marsh family for 3 generations, 60 acres of bottomland along the Greer Creek that flooded hard every 4th spring and dried black and rich every summer that followed. Her grandfather had worked it with a mule. Her father had worked it alone after the mule died and there was no money for a new one. Della had worked it beside her father until she was 12, and then beside her husband Raymond until he died of a lung condition 14 years ago, and then alone after that. The land was not romantic. It was hard and low, and it flooded and it cracked, but it was hers, and it had fed them, and her father had always said the same thing before he started any serious work on it. He would put both hands flat on the soil, and he would say, "The ground keeps what you give it." He said it the way other men said grace before a meal, as though it were a fact more dependable than most prayers. The trouble had started quietly, the way most serious trouble does. 3 years before the morning in the bank, a company called Verdant Land Holdings had begun buying up parcels east of Callaway Creek. They moved, without announcement, through shell arrangements and through brokers who didn't carry business cards. They acquired 17 parcels in 14 months, mostly from older landowners who were tired, or whose children had left, or who had simply run out of the energy required to keep saying no. Della had said no twice. The third time, they stopped asking. And then, 2 years ago, she had received a notice from the county assessor's office that the valuation of her 60 acres had been revised upward. Significantly, it had moved from $48,000 to $112,000, and with it came a reassessed property tax figure that added up over the course of a year to something she could not simply pull from the operation of a 60-acre bottomland farm running on a single pair of hands and a 12-year-old tractor. She had gone to the bank. She had asked for a small operating loan against the land, enough to bridge the tax increase until she could bring in and sell the late summer harvest. Gerald Foss had listened to her for 9 minutes. She had timed it afterward, sitting in her truck in the lot, because it had felt shorter than 9 minutes. Then he had told her the land's income history did not support the loan. He had said the valuation created a leverage risk the bank was not in a position to accept. He had said it cleanly, without malice, which in certain ways was worse. She had stood up. She had picked up her coat. And she had said calmly, the way her father had spoken about the ground, "I'll come back in a year." He had not answered. The room had not cared. She had driven home that day with the heat broken in the truck, her breath fogging the windshield, and she had sat at the kitchen table her father had built, and she had thought for a long time, not about the bank, about the land, about what the land had always been asked to carry and what it had always eventually given back. Then she had begun. She planted the 60 acres in 3 rotations that spring and summer. She put in market crops on the upper third, a contract vegetable arrangement with a food cooperative 2 counties east. She worked the creek bottom acres in specialty grains that a Kraft miller 90 miles north had agreed to take on trial. She kept the southern strip in cover crop, feeding it back into itself. She drove the tractor herself, maintained it herself, with parts she sourced from a junkyard 2 towns over, and a service manual she had found in her late husband's workshop. She sold at 3 different markets, 1 each in neighboring towns, and she kept every receipt, every ledger entry, every sale record in a brown folder with a cracking rubber band. She had not asked anyone for help with the books. She had done them at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings under a lamp with a cracked shade. And she had set aside each month a portion of everything that came in, not a large portion, but a faithful one, the way her father had always tithed the first row of any harvest back into the soil, because some things you give back before you spend. The county assessor's record was something she had found on her own. She had not been looking for it exactly. She had been sitting in the county records room one February morning, searching through land transfer filings, when she found the chain of ownership on the 6 parcels surrounding her 60 acres. She had found names she did not recognize, and she had found something else. An easement agreement filed in 1987 that ran directly across 3 of those parcels and touched the southwestern corner of her land. The agreement had been entered into by the original landowners of those parcels and a water management authority that had since been absorbed by the county itself. The terms of that easement were specific. No structure, no permanent improvement, no grading or drainage alteration was to be made within 40 feet of the easement corridor without the consent of all landholders whose land the corridor touched. One of those landholders, according to the original document, was the predecessor title to her 60 acres, which meant, under the recorded terms of the agreement, that her 60 acres held a consent right that no subsequent development could lawfully bypass. Ferdinand Holdings had already filed a preliminary grading permit for the parcel directly adjacent to hers. The grading plan extended to within 22 feet of the easement line. Without her signed consent, that permit was in violation of a recorded county agreement that had never been extinguished, never been amended, and never, it appeared, been noticed by anyone for 38 years. She had sat in that records room for a long time. The fluorescent light above her had buzzed. Outside, the February wind had moved through the empty lot. She had folded the copy of the easement document and placed it in the brown folder. Then she had gone home and continued working. The morning at the bank, Gerald Foss had been speaking for nearly 4 minutes when he paused. He had been explaining again the bank's position on rural land lending. He was thorough. He was precise. He did not use unnecessary words. He was the kind of man who could deliver difficult information without ever technically being unkind, and he had clearly decided that this meeting would proceed the same way the last one had, perhaps ending with a different conversation about a payment plan or a referral to a county assistance program. He had the particular confidence of someone who held all the instruments of the official process and knew it. He paused because Della Marsh had opened the brown folder. She did it without rush, without announcement. She placed 3 documents on the counter in a clean row, the way a card player lays cards, not dramatically, just precisely. The first was a 12-month income and expense statement, handwritten in columns, with receipts stapled in order behind it. The second was a certified appraisal from an independent assessor, not the county's, that had been commissioned 4 months prior and put the working value of her 60 acres based on demonstrated income from the most recent 3 crop seasons at $139,000. The third was the easement document, the 1987 agreement, the corridor, the consent clause. Gerald Foss looked at the documents. He picked up the appraisal first. He read it with the practiced speed of a man who reads figures for a living. Something in his posture changed. Not much, a fraction, but the room was quiet enough to notice it. "This is an independent appraisal," he said. "It is," she said. He set it down. He picked up the easement document. He read the header. He read the signatory clause at the bottom. He read the corridor description. He read the consent provision. He read it again. The teller at the far end of the counter had stopped typing. The 2 men on the wooden chairs had stopped looking at their phones. The young couple near the door had gone still. Foss set the document down slowly. He looked at Della Marsh, and his expression had not broken. Not completely, but the certainty behind it had shifted into something more careful. "This easement," he began, "would require verification through county records before the bank could consider it material to any decision." "It is county records," she said. "Filed March 3rd, 1987. Document number 87CE0041. The county clerk's office has a duplicate. I have a certified copy." She touched the folder. "There are 3 more pages." He was quiet for a moment. A controlled, institutional quiet. Then he said, "Mrs. Marsh, even if this easement is valid, I'm not certain what you're asking the bank to do with it." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I'm not here to ask the bank anything." She placed her hand on the sack. She untied the twine at its neck. She reached in and removed a series of envelopes, each sealed and labeled in handwritten ink, each containing a banded portion of cash that she had pulled together over 12 months, one careful row at a time, one careful market at a time, one Sunday ledger at a time. She set them in a second row on the counter, next to the documents. She said, "I'm here to pay the 2 years of revised tax assessment in full, because that's what the land needed. And then I'm here to tell you that Verdant Land Holdings cannot file a valid grading permit for the parcel on the eastern boundary until I sign a consent form, which I have no intention of signing." The room said nothing. Gerald Foss said nothing. He was looking at the envelopes. He was looking at the easement document. He was looking at Della Marsh. He picked up the income statement. He turned to the second page. He turned to the third. He set it down. He said in a voice somewhat quieter than before, "I see," she said. "I imagined you would." The county assessor's office confirmed the easement within 3 working days. A land use attorney who had been brought in by Verdant Land Holdings reviewed the filing and issued a memo to his client that same week, acknowledging the validity of the consent clause and recommending against proceeding with the grading permit without resolution of the easement matter. Verdant reached out to Della through their broker, the one without the business cards. He came out to the farm on a Thursday afternoon, drove a clean black truck down her gravel lane, stood in her doorway with an offer written on company stationery. It was a fair number by most standards. More than the assessed value of her land, more than the appraisal. He said it came with a relocation allowance. He said the company respected her position. He read from the stationery as he spoke. which told her that the words were not his, and the respect was not either. She let him finish. She was holding a mug of coffee. She looked past him toward the field, where the cover crop on the southern strip had started to show the first pale green of early growth against the dark ground. She said, "I'm not selling." He waited, as though she might add something. She did not, he nodded. He walked back to his truck. She watched him drive out the way he had come, and then she went inside and finished her coffee. Verdant Land Holdings filed a revised permit application 2 months later, one that stayed well clear of the easement corridor. The grading on the adjacent parcel was scaled back substantially. 3 of the 17 parcels they had previously acquired showed similar easement-related constraints. Once a county land use advocate, alerted to the 1987 document, began reviewing the corridor chain in full. 2 of those parcel sales were later challenged by surviving family members of the original sellers. The county began a formal review of easement documentation across its recorded land corridor system, the first such comprehensive review in over 20 years. None of that was what Della had set out to do. She had set out to keep her land. She had kept it. The rest was what happened when an old promise faithfully recorded and honestly found turned out to still mean exactly what it said. The issue had never been 60 acres. It had been whether the record would hold and whether anyone would remember it long enough to make it matter. She had remembered. The paper had held. On the Saturday morning after the tax payment cleared, Della Marsh drove her truck out to the southern strip before the sun was fully up. She parked at the edge of the field and walked out onto it, her boots leaving shallow prints in the soft ground. The cover crop was thin and new, barely an inch above the soil, but it covered the ground in a low, even sheet of pale green that caught the early light in a way that was almost difficult to look at directly. She crouched down, the way her father always had, and she put both hands flat on the ground. The soil was cold, damp from an overnight dew, dense and honest beneath her palms. She stayed like that for a while. She did not speak out loud, but she was thinking what he had always said. The ground keeps what you give it. There was a notebook in her coat pocket, the one she had been keeping since spring, that held a rough plan for the next 3 seasons. The middle section was blank, reserved for notes she hadn't written yet, for decisions she hadn't needed to make yet. She took it out and opened it to the first blank page. She took a pen from the same pocket. She wrote 1 line at the top of the page, then she put the notebook away. She stood up from the ground, slow and certain, and walked back toward her truck as the sun came over the tree line and laid its first warm angle across the field. There is one more story worth your time. It begins with a woman who found a deed inside an old iron stove. Not filed, not recorded, just folded and stored inside the firebox, the way her grandmother had stored anything that needed to survive. The deed described 40 acres of timber ground that a railroad company had taken in 1948 under a condemnation order that, according to a legal notice her grandmother had kept tucked behind the deed, had never been properly finalized. The railroad is gone now, but the land is still there, and so is the paper. That story is coming.